Hello and welcome to Furhammer Videos. Sorry you can't see my face this week, but the reason is I look an absolute mess. So here's some pretty Space Wolves to look at that we're about to go through a painting tutorial on. Please don't forget to like, comment and subscribe. To begin, and for a deep colour, start by priming the model in black. Now I'm using Vallejo airbrush primer. Stynal Res is an alternate airbrush option. You can alternatively use a spray primer. Whilst I'm using an airbrush a lot in this tutorial, I want you to be able to follow it if you just have brushes. So stick with me and we'll do that. And for those interested, I got the extra parts from thecustombit.com, and he does more like these Spartan parts, which I'm filming for a future tutorial. To begin, we're going to base the entire model in the fang. Now I'm using the airbrush paint purely for convenience, as in convenient that I don't want to mix it. Where they're inconvenient is they come in these daft pots and not in dropper bottles, so getting them into the airbrush cup can be a bit of a pain. So just start, base your entire miniature. Now again, I'm airbrushing here for speed. If you've got some of the, like the Artist Opus Series D dry brushes, you can just sort of stipple it on with those. Or if you've just got normal brushes, then just paint it on. But basically, cover the entire miniature in the fang for that deep, deep blue shadow colour. Now that we've got our shadows blocked in, I'm going to use Rust Grey for the mid-tone. Now, when I say shadow and mid-tone, I'm not talking about the recessed shadows, we're going to darken them later. I'm talking about the armour shadows. So the armour is going to have three tones, a shadow, this mid-tone, and then the next highlight. Now, I'm airbrushing here, but instead of doing a 45-degree highlight around the whole model, I am focusing on small areas like the knees, the backpack, the shoulder pads, the chest plate, and trying to pick out individual forms. Now, if you don't have access to an airbrush, you can do this with dry brushing with the Artist Opus dry brushes, or just paint it on, but that's going to take hours. And finally, the highlight, we're going to use Fenrisian Grey. One of the other reasons I'm picking the Citadel colours for this tutorial is because I know there's a lot of people out there who are colour purist when it comes to their Warhammer armies. So I'm going to be focusing quite primarily on Citadel colours where I can in here, and then only switch to other colours where they're fairly generic anyway, like blacks, whites, and a few metallics. With this technique, I'm trying to pick out the middle of what I'd painted before. So things like cylinders, I'm doing a line, circles, I'm just spraying a spot in the middle of it. That's for things like the knees and the ankles and stuff like that. So just try and pick out certain parts of the model to really highlight them. Now I'm back to Fenrisian Grey again, but this time the layer paint, and I'm going to be using my Artist Opus medium dry brush. The reason for this is because now that I've done the highlights and picked out and highlighted the forms, I'm going to use this to do all of the edge highlighting on the model. So this is I'm basically going to turn the model upside down, dry brush it from below, so anywhere that is an edge is now going to be caught with that paint, and it's going to help to pick it out and just reinforce the shape of each and every part of the model's armour. Now, arguably, as I said before, you can do this whole guide with a dry brush. You don't need to use the airbrush at all. Personally, I'm just more experienced with the airbrush. I am much faster with the airbrush, and I don't find you can get as smooth blends as you have here on the base of the backpack or on the back of the leg here. Now, to be fair, what we're doing later with shadowing it, does that matter anyway? Not really sure. Your call. So I'm going to add some more distress to the model here, and similar to the dry brushing technique, I'm going to take this bit of sponge and dip it in some paint, dab it off, and then gently, very gently, dab the model just to pick up a few areas where it looks like the paint has started to chip and wear through. This is completely optional. I find it adds more distress and texture to the surface of the armour, but it's completely your call. You can totally skip this and the model's still going to look good by the end of it. So now we're going to do the bit I like to avoid if I can, but we're going to be doing some masking. Now again, if you're doing this with a brush, you don't need to do this, but if you're using a dry brush or airbrush, I highly recommend masking for the next step because it's going to make everything much faster. I prefer Silly Putty as my masking product of choice. Blue tack I find is a bit too sticky, sticks to the model, sometimes brings paint off, and the liquid mask is an absolute nightmare to control. Do not use it with brushes because it will ruin a brush in absolutely no time. So next I'm doing these shoulder pads in Mephiston Red, and I know these are support units and therefore should be yellow shoulder pads, but I can't go back and refilm it now, and it also adds a bit more variety to this video. So just spray the areas that aren't masked with Mephiston Red. And then for the mid-tone on these, or first level of highlight, we're using Evil Sun Scarlet. Just get the direction right, so line up the part against the model, and then make sure you're spraying in the correct direction so that the light casts along it in the right way. And then for the highlight, we're going to take some Troll Slayer Orange. And this, like the previous step and what we did for the armour, just try and get this in the central point of what you've previously highlighted with your airbrush. Again, you can do this with a dry brush, or you can blend it with a normal brush. My favourite part of using the silly putty is when you come to remove it, so just sit back, relax and enjoy and watch the transition of the two armour shades you've done previously be revealed. So for yellow, we're going to start with Avalon Sunset, and just to begin this again, start by covering the bits that you don't want to be yellow. So here, that's the shoulder pad that we've painted red and the arm from the earlier steps. With the yellow, because it's going over black, you are going to need a few extra passes. So again, if you're airbrushing this, just try and give it one light pass and then go over again. Make sure you're giving good attention to those recesses. The problem with the yellow over black is not so much the coverage, but it's more that when you leave any areas that aren't fully yellow, you end up with this horrible muddy black. It's not really a brown black, which is what you want. It's more of just, it's like a dirty black. It's horrible. So make sure you get a good heavy coverage with the Avalon Sunset and cover everything in yellow. To highlight, we're going to use Flash Kits Yellow. Once again, pay attention to the direction that the part is going to sit on the model. So this axe is going to sit downwards, so spray the shoulder pad from above, and then also spray some of the top parts of the axe. Try and keep the highlights away from the hand. I'll explain why in the next step. With the shields, I'm doing a line down the middle first, so that kind of gives the curvature a bit of highlight, but then I'm putting a lot of focus on the top, so you've got that top to bottom fade across the shield's face. And now once again, just the bit that I always find compelling to watch, the reveal of all the colours that we've painted in previous steps. I'm using Avalon Sunset again, here the base colour, and I'm also going to switch to my Artist Opus Series M size 0 brush. This is just for some controlled areas, so this is why I said keep the highlight away from the hands, because what we want to do is use that area where we accidentally masked, and then using this brush and this thicker paint, we're going to fill in those gaps. Now for some quick and simple faces, we're going to use Rhinox Hide. I've masked the model up again, and it's just a case of giving the face a complete base coat in this colour. For the mid-tone, I'm using Deathclaw Brown. You can use Bugman's Glow. I find that a bit pinky, and I want these on the grimdark side of things. So just adding that deep brown colour to the general face of the model. I'm going at an angle here, kind of 45 degrees. I'm not doing it sort of directly down. I'm focusing from one side of the face because I want the face to really pop out to you when you look at the face from the front, and kind of also have that top to bottom fade and also that left to right fade, which really gives some dimension. So to highlight, I'm using Kislev Flesh. Now you can, once again, you can airbrush, dry brush, or just normal brush this, but I'm going for speed, so I just want to lightly airbrush this. Again, I'm going at a kind of 45-degree angle, not only just from like the top of the model, but from the side, because again, I want to give that dimension top to bottom, left to right, and leave some kind of fade when you're looking directly at the face. Once again, the fun part. So now I've gone as far as I can realistically go with the airbrush, it's time to block in some colour. First up is Mechanicus Standard Grey, which I'm going to use to just fill in the areas of soft armour plating. So things like the groin joints, the knee joints, the elbow joints, things like the hoses up the backpack as well. We're just going to paint these with Mechanicus Standard Grey and call it done. All the leather areas are going to get painted with Rhinox hide. This is great because it's going to give a nice contrast to all those cool areas on the armour. I'm using Pigments Glow now to do all of the edge highlighting on the leather areas, and there's some logic behind this. I was told a long time ago, if you're ever doing edge highlighting or distress on leather, then use a skin colour. The reason for that is leather is made of skin, so when it gets distressed, it will return to its natural skin colour. So no matter what colour it is, Pigments Glow or some kind of skin tone is always my first level of edge distressing on any leather parts on models. The dry brushing technique really helps here because not only does the texture that it leaves really sell that idea of distress, but also the technique itself only picks out the raised edges, those edges that would naturally be caught through general wear and tear. Bringing in some Screaming Skull now, I'm going to let this mix in with the Pigments Glow and create a just sort of off-whitey skin colour. First I'm going to highlight the faces with these and pick out all the extremities, but you can also use this colour for highlighting all of the leather areas that you've done before. As you're painting with this colour, just gradually move slowly towards pure Screaming Skull, and then you will find that not only have you highlighted it in no time at all, but you've actually built up a general and gradual transition from a fleshy colour to a really pale, bright skin colour. So here I'm using Troll Slayer Orange again, and yes, I'm using the air paint even though I'm brushing it on. You can just thin the normal paint, but I had this to hand, and the good thing about the air paints is they do paint on like normal contrast paints, just a lot more opaque. I'm now using Corvus Black because it's more of a blue black. I don't want to use true black or true white on any model, and I'm just filling in the purity seals. The reason I've chosen black on this is because I don't really want them to stand out. I don't want them to draw attention. They aren't very Space Wolfy. To cover the cloth parts of the seals, I'm using Wraithbone. Now you can choose any kind of cream or off-white colour that you like, but the reason I've gone for this is because it's a base paint and I want to get the coverage on in as few coats as possible. So here, even though some of the raised edges are still slightly blue, I'm going to leave it with one coat and then done. Honestly, in the end result, you won't even be able to tell. And then after I've got all my colours done, I'm moving on to metallics, starting with the dark aluminium from Vallejo Metal colour range. I shouldn't need to explain at this point why I'm using this paint, just look how smoothly this goes onto your models. And for a metallic paint, which are normally more gloopy and more oily, these go on like an absolute dream. So if you haven't used this range yet, I certainly suggest picking up a few of them. So next, and once again from the Vallejo Metal colour range, I'm now using Copper. Copper is one of only two colours in the range that isn't a silver, and this stuff again, it goes down like an absolute dream. It's one coat and it's an absolutely incredible finish. It really is. It's one of the best metallic colours you can get. If you've painted with metallic paints, you know how thick they are, you know that it needs 2 or 3 coats, you know that it needs to go down over a very dark colour in order to be highlighted. With these, it's like hobby cheating, just literally very light amount. It flows really nicely, almost too much, and just get it down on your model and before long you will realize how shiny it is. Also, I'm doing a bit of Space Wolf cheating here. Normally these shoulder pad rims would be blue, but that would be an absolute nightmare to mask off. So in my army, the shoulder pad rims are all going to be copper and match the Aquila or any other ornamentation on the models. So that's the initial stage done. We've got the model painted. The only thing I've done extra here is I've painted the eyes with a line of white and a dot of black, but you can stop here and I think you'd find that that's a fairly impressive squad of models. If we want to take it to the next step, keep going and watch the rest of the video, but this is it for stage one and I think you'll find this is fairly impressive. What we're going to do now is make them look a lot worse before we make them look better. So to begin, we're going to use a gloss varnish. Now, the reason I'm doing this, and I don't often do this on my models, but I really want to preserve the vibrancy of all those blues and reds and yellows in the next stages of the painting technique. And what we're going to do, as you're probably aware, is cover it in oil paint and wipe it off. Now, the problem with not putting a gloss varnish on is if you put oil paint on top of it, certain pigments, well, all pigments really, but certain pigments especially, will absolutely ruin the surface of the model. So I did this at about 10 o'clock at night thinking, right, I can't touch this for several hours. I'm just covering it in gloss varnish, all of the models getting covered in gloss varnish, and I'm leaving them a good solid day to dry. If I don't do that, then I'm going to end up with problems that you'll probably find I had in my Fafnir Ran video. So last time I said, do what I say, not what I do. This time, do what I'm doing. Cover it in gloss varnish, leave it till the next day at the very least before you move further. I'm now going to apply some transfers using Microset and Microsol, and to avoid making mistakes when painting pack markings and to get them perfect, I'm going to apply some of these marking transfers which I got from themightybrush.com. Additionally, I've got these from the Indomitus starter set. When cutting out transfers, it's really important to get as close as possible to the actual transfer itself. All transfers come with a bit of a clear white backing, and that can play havoc when trying to get it to conform to certain parts of your model. So if there is any clear area of your transfer that you can cut away before applying it, I highly recommend you do that in advance of trying to get it on your model. So when you're actually trying to soak a transfer to get it off the sheet, you can drop it in some water, but the problem is you've then got to go fishing to get it out, which can be an absolute nightmare. What I recommend you do instead is you can just get some tissue paper, pop your transfer on top of this and then soak it in some water. Yeah, it'll take a little bit longer for your transfer to become loose, but once it does, you'll find it's a lot easier to just transfer from this onto your brush and then straight onto your model. So begin by getting some Microset, not Sol, we'll get onto that in a minute, and then just apply that liberally across the surface that you're going to apply the transfer to. This will give us plenty of movement time. Slide the transfer off the decal sheet. I'd recommend doing this when it's close to the model, it's a lot easier, and then apply it down. And then just using your brush and Microset, don't use water, we want the water out of it, move it until it's in place, and then very gently with something like a cotton bud, you want to try and roll out the excess water from underneath and try and get all of that water removed. Once that's on and dry, give it about 20-30 minutes. Just do the same with the Microsol. So this time you want to just liberally cover it with Microsol, and if you've got any creases in the transfers that you've applied, you can, so long as this has started to dry. So give it about 2-3 minutes while it just sits there, starts to dissolve the transfer that you've applied, and then just roll that crease out and try and get it removed from the transfer before you leave it for about an hour or so to dry. This is also a good time to sponge on some additional weathering. Time for oil paints, and we're starting off with Abteilung 502's Shadow Brown. This, to be honest, it reads as black when it's on the model, but it is a brown, trust me. So we're going to get this, we're going to thin it down pretty thin. You can kind of see on the edges there around the palette how thin we've got it. If you drag it up the side and it runs back and becomes watery, that's where you want it. And I'm applying this gently to the model until I realise, yep, that's flowing nicely and it's not thickly covering the areas, and then we're just going to apply it liberally to the model. If it's too thick, then it's going to take me an age to work off, and we don't want to do that. We want it so it's sticky enough so that it sits in the recesses. If you thin it down too much and then paint it on the model, it won't actually stick at places like there at the top of the shoulder pad. It'll all run down to the bottom, the top won't have any paint in it at all, and it'll absolutely ruin it. So once you've done that, just start with a sponge, something like one of these makeup sponges, and begin to clean it off. You want to make sure the paint's dry before you begin this, so give it a good, I'd say at least 20 minutes. If you can, leave it an hour, but you've got several hours to play with, so you can leave it 4 or 5 hours and come back and do it later. The next level we're going to do is again Absalom 502, and this time dark rust, and I'm applying this with an airbrush, really because I was just trying something out for the video, but also I found that this was a much better way to apply it. It got it evenly across the surface of the model, and when it came to removing the paint, I didn't have all of those recesses which were still wet with slightly thinned oil paint. So this to me is my preferred method. If you don't have an airbrush, you can just paint it on as I did with the previous step, but once it's dry, just begin to wipe it away with something like a makeup sponge. So I tend to avoid what we call cotton buds and Americans call Q-tips because they can leave fibres all over your model. But actually when you use these, you'll find that it can leave a nice mottled texture on certain surfaces. So as it builds the paint up, I'd use this to reapply it, and then I'll just clean the fibres off later. Now I'm going to highlight the shadows with AK Interactive's Light Rust Wash, and I know what you're thinking, highlighting shadows, what? Well, the idea is it's just going to add a bit more visual interest to some of the darker areas of the model. So anywhere really dark or really thick with the previous colours, I'm just adding a touch of this Light Rust Wash and it makes it look a little more interesting. And now we're going to do a similar thing with the Oxide Blue Patina from Absalom 502. Again here, I'm just kind of smashing it on. Anywhere where the previous brown has built up heavily, I'm going to apply the blue over the top of it, because those areas are the bits that I haven't been able to wipe away, so generally look more weathered with the brown. And then I'm going through this reductive stage again of not only wiping it off, but blending it in. To highlight this area of shadow or weathering, we're using turquoise lights, which whatever, it's just a beautiful colour, and the more of this I can get on a model that's weathered or weathered brass or copper or bronze or something like that, it just looks gorgeous. So I'm going to touch this to any of the thicker areas, and if I put too much on, I can easily wipe it away. And the beginning of our finishing touches, I'm using Vallejo's matte acrylic varnish. Here, first of all, I'm just dusting the model to make sure that I've got all of those fibres off from earlier stages, things like the cotton buds or Q-tips. If it doesn't pull them off, it at least raises them up so I can pick them off with a pair of tweezers. And here, as you can't see, I'm applying the matte varnish. If you haven't used a finishing varnish on your models, I highly recommend you do. It's a great way of bringing the model together. It does tend to, it'll dull down metallics, because metallics should really be shiny and glossy, not black, but it'll also bring everything to a very consistent look. So if you're painting your models and you've got things like brush strokes on there, this is a really, really great way to conceal them, and it also seals in things like those decals on the shoulder pads. So when you actually look at the model, everything looks unified and crisp, and people will look at your models and go, oh my god, how did you achieve that level of detail so thin? This brings it all together. Base the model as you see fit, and then pick an appropriate pigment. So for Space Wolves you can use snow, surely, yeah, that's fine, but I already had these bases made and I wanted to get them used, so I picked an appropriate kind of dry, muddy earth colour, and then just jabbed this essentially at the model and kind of faded it up the legs. All this does really is tie the model to the base, and yes, you can do this and probably should do this before the matte stage, but I've always found that applying a varnish just blows the pigment everywhere, and I want it stuck to the model. I've never really got the hang of sticking pigment to a model with any kind of pigment fixer or dry brush. So as my models are for display only, I just put this on afterwards. They're not going to move, it's not going to go anywhere, and just jab this at the model to kind of fade it in and tie it into the base. And then finally, we're painting the base rims with Vallejo model colour 950 black. If you've never used this paint before, please go and get yourself a bottle, use it, and then say thank you down in the comments. And that's it, one quick and simple squad of Space Wolves complete. Whilst you look at these, I'm just going to drop our patrons up on the sides of the video so you can see who you've got to thank for this even being in existence if you like the video. Also, feel free to have a look at these and just slow the video down, pause it, comment, critique, let me know what you think down in the comments. Feel free to slate them if you don't like them, but I'm fairly impressed with them considering they took hardly any time at all. After all, these videos are for those of you like me who love miniature painting but get frustrated with things like the tedium of edge highlighting and spending weeks and weeks on a series of models only to be disappointed at the end of it. This really takes no time at all. You can just quickly spray it, dry brush it, paint it however you want, and you should have an impressive looking model or series of models at the end. If you did like the video, please don't forget to like, comment and subscribe.